Okay, so there are so many different testing frameworks, too many to mention, and they serve different purposes. Historically, when I teach this class, I teach using Jest to do unit testing of React. But this time, I thought it might be more beneficial to teach you a different kind of testing framework, an integration testing framework like Cypress, since we've already done quite a bit of unit testing throughout the course, right? We did unit testing in Ruby and in Rails, and we did unit testing of our Express server. So let's look at a different kind of testing framework. And we're going to look at Cypress. So we'll look at installing Cypress, how we use the test runner, how to write tests, how we can make Cypress test our development in production environments, and we'll talk about some concepts like testing best practice concepts. How should we write tests? What should we keep in mind when we're writing tests? And how can we keep our tests from being brittle? Keep our tests robust so that small changes that shouldn't break our tests don't break our tests. And that's a lot of things to cover. We'll see how we go. So there's all the things, lots of things. And I'm only going to show you testing one basic workflow because it's going to take us a while, I think, to go through this kind of information. And we'll look at testing the login, logout workflow, and then I'll invite you to practice testing at least one other workflow in the blog client to solidify what I teach you today. And then you can, apply it to your own assessment. Of course, since this is integration testing, it's not something you'll implement until towards the end of your work, right? Not until you've got a React client, pretty well written, the server's written. That has to be done before you can use this testing framework. So that's why I encourage you today or soon to practice what I teach you today by implementing one other testing flow at least in the blog client, okay? Just so you can practice the concepts I teach you today so you don't forget, all right? So first, let's start by installing Cypress. So we install it as a development dependency, not as a production requirement. So we do that by, if you're using Yarn, you pass the --dev argument, and if you're using npm, then you pass the --save-dev argument. So we'll do that first in our blog client directory. Do a yarn add Cypress dev. We'll let that go. Taking its time for me. How's it going for you guys? Is it taking its time? You done? Right.
And then yarn in your blog client folder.
Yep.
Yarn install.
Add.
Yarn add.
Yarn
add Cypress
--dev.
--dev.
So once you have it installed, you can say yarn run Cypress open, which is in the lesson. It's the next thing that we do, and this opens the test runner.
Does it take a while to do something?
Takes a while to install. It took a while for me to install. So the first time you open the test runner, it gives you a little pop-up that says we've added some folders and example tests to your project. Okay, try running the test in the examples folder. Add your own test files to the Cypress integration folder. Okay, so yeah, thanks. So we can have a look at these examples and just see how the test runner runs. So it opens up to this test tab, which lists all the tests that are defined. And then there's a runs tab, which we'll talk about later. This is when we set it up for recording, our recorded runs will show up here. And then there's a settings tab with some settings. But if we look at the test, if we click on one of these example tests, you can see how it works. So it opens a browser, and then it tells you Chrome's being controlled by automated test software, and it runs the tests that are in that spec file. And you can see that it actually manipulates the browser like a user would when it runs the tests. And it's nice because you can click on any of these to see some details about that test. We'll look later if there's an error. It can be useful. It'll tell you about the error here if there's an error, but it can be useful to open up inspect in the console when there's an error, because sometimes there's more information in the console than what's given here. And another thing is if you click on these things, there's some nice console output. If you click on the details, it tells you, for instance, the command that was run, the Cypress command, what was yielded by that command, which is sort of, you can think of that as like being what's returned by the Cypress command, but it's not really what's returned exactly, because what's returned has a lot of, it's sort of like the Cypress object that a lot of methods can be executed on and things like that. So what's yielded really is the element that comes back from that Cypress command, which you could then execute further commands on if you wanted to. So this is really, really useful, what you see here in the console if you click on each of these little details. So we'll have a look at this more as we go along. So you can see that there were 14 tests and all of them passed. And if we look in VS Code and we look in the Cypress folder that got created when we installed Cypress, we can see under integration and examples what the contents of these tests look like. So this is nice because this gives you like heaps of examples. You can look at how they're doing things, and you can use that and modify it to test your own stuff. So that's really nice, I think, that it comes with so many examples. So that's another reason I like Cypress. It comes with a huge number of examples, and it also, the documentation that you find on their website is also really good. Okay, so you can have a look at that. When you're developing your own test, have a look at those examples and let that help you to guide you into how you can write your own test. Okay, another thing I want to point out is if you look at the test runner, this guy here, it'll tell you up here in the right hand corner which browser is being used. So it's using Chrome, and I tell it to stop. So if it's running, stop it. You can select the browser that you want to use. So Chromium 78, Electron 78, Chrome. You can read more about those browser choices and what the implications are and so forth, but I'm going to have Chrome selected for this lesson. I think if you use Electron, it doesn't actually open the browser, I think. I say that because when I ran it in command line mode, which we'll look at later, it didn't open a browser when it chose Electron, but it did when I chose Chrome. So, all right. So, things we could test in our blog client app. We could test things like user registration, user login, logout. So you'd sort of test flows, user flows with Cypress. That we can display all the posts when we visit the home page, that we can display only the user's post when we visit my blog, that we can add a post, edit a post, delete a post. We can add a comment to a post. So basically, you look at each of your user flows or user stories, your main user stories, and you can write tests that test each of those with Cypress. So in order to test multiple environments, so we could test our local or our dev environment, and we could test our deployed or production environment. We can use environment or configuration variables with Cypress, and there are a few ways to do this, okay? But we can use these config files. We can add a variable called base URL to indicate which URL we want Cypress to go to run our test, and that will be our client URL. Okay, so if we give it localhost 3000, then it's going to test our development deployment application, and if we give it our deployed URL, then it's going to test that one. Okay, and as far as which server it's going to test, well, it'll depend on what the client's pointing to. So you can modify your client, for example, to point to your local server, or you can have it point to your deployed server. And if you test with Cypress on your local URL and your client's pointing to your deployed server, then what you're testing is your local client and your deployed server. Okay, so the way that we can specify the base URL, the first way is to edit the cypress.json file, which gets created when we install Cypress into the project. It's in the root directory of our project, and it is read first. Typically, the cypress.json file contains configuration that is common between all the developers on our team, and it doesn't contain any sensitive information, and we check it into our repository. Okay, so we can put it there, and then there are other options like a cypress.config.json file, which typically contains information that either changes between developers, maybe changes between deployment scenarios that are different versions of the application we're testing, and it overrides what's in the Cypress JSON file. So you could put, for example, testing local, or whatever your dev environment URL is. If you're in a bigger team, you might have a dev environment that's not your local machine, that's on some virtual machine or something that everybody logs into, or that you deploy, like the the current dev branch version of your code, for example. So maybe you might have that as the base URL in your Cypress JSON that's checked in, and maybe you can override that with your Cypress config JSON with your personal local URL. So there's some flexibility there. You also can just set an environment variable. So you can set an environment variable that begins with the word Cypress, all caps, underscore base URL, for example, or another variable that Cypress recognizes, and that will take precedence over anything that's in either of the JSON files. And as a last thing, you could set a variable when you launch Cypress, when you launch the test runner. You can say, for example, Cypress base URL equals this thing, yarn run Cypress, or launch Cypress directly from the command line, and that will take precedence over anything else. So there's some good documentation on the Cypress page about all of those ways to set configuration. So if you look at the Cypress page and you look at the docs, they're really good. If we look at configuration,
In your thing, or does it open a window when you go
it opens a window. Environment variables. So if you look at this documentation, it tells you about all the different ways that you can set environment variables. So it's not Cypress config JSON, it's Cypress env JSON. Cypress env JSON, export is Cypress underscore whatever the variable name is. Pass it in the CLI as a --env, that's another option. You can set it just directly on the command line as well. So yeah, all these different ways. And it actually doesn't have to be in all caps. So that's a sort of a shell convention to set environment variables in all caps, but it looks like it probably understands it whether you have it in all caps or not. Okay, so what we're going to do is in our cypress.json file, we're just going to set base URL to localhost. So the cypress.json file is just in the root directory of our client. You'll see it's already got empty brackets in it, and we're just going to type base URL, and it has to be quoted, and we'll put So we'll just put our local host.
Not the
And it's not capital RL. I just double checked.
what is it?
Why isn't my Vim plugin working? Oh, it's because I don't have it installed on this machine. That's so annoying. Alright, so it's actually little RL. I just double checked.
URL.
Base URL. So by setting base URL, what that will allow is that in our tests when we write them, we don't have to put that URL every time we're telling it where to go. Okay, that's another option, is you could hard code the URL in your test, in each one of your tests, but that's a bit silly, right? We understand why that's not a good idea. Yeah. So we'll set it here. All right, so okay, so everybody knows what server they're using from their client if you're following along. So it is possible also to actually, from your Cypress spec, to launch your app. There are commands to do that, but that's not a best practice. So it's suggested that your app is running before you run your Cypress test. Okay? So Cypress, in order for the Cypress test to run, your client, your application, the one you're testing, has to be running. All right? And you can either launch it from Cypress or you can launch it before you launch the test runner, before you launch the spec in your test runner. And the best practice is to launch it beforehand and not to launch it from Cypress. So there's some documentation about that if you click on that link about why that's true. Okay, so after a PR is merged, so when you get to sort of after you've got the React side of your app developed reasonably, then every time you're deploying sort of updates to that, a PR is merged, and you redeploy your app, then you should be running your integration test against your production app as well, your deployed app, right, to make sure that you didn't break anything with that PR merge. And so what you can do is you can set the environment variable Cypress base URL prior to launching the test runners. One thing you could do. So just set it to point to your, your deployed client, and then run the test runner. And you don't have to change any files if you do that. So that's sort of an easy way to do things. And you can set it just directly on the command line like that. You can set an environment variable with export. You can, do it any number of ways, or you could use that --env flag to specify the variable as well. Okay, any of those will work, and that way you can just run the test runner against your production instance after you merge a PR and deploy. Okay, so we're all set up for this lesson. So writing Cypress tests looks a lot like what we've been doing with unit testing. So we have describe blocks and it blocks. We can have context blocks. We use assertions. Cypress uses try assertions, so you could use should or expect. All of that looks very much the same. We can use hooks for before and before each and after each. All of that is just the same. Cypress is actually based on Mocha. It's not Mocha exactly, but it's based on that, and it uses chai, so it's really similar to the things that we've seen already. There are some differences, of course, but a lot of it will look pretty familiar to us. One of the things that we want to think about, and this is true for the unit tests we've been writing too, but it's particularly something we have to be aware of in integration testing, because it can be really tempting. We can get a little bit lazy and think, okay, I'm going to write one test to log in, and in the same test I'll test log out, or I'll run a test to log in, and then I'll write a test to see that I can go to my blog and see that my posts are displayed. I have to be logged in for that, right? And I'll just write the login test before the testing to see if I can go to my blog, and I'll just always run them in that order, right? But that's a really bad practice. So our test should always be able to run independently. So if we write our test that way and the login test fails, then the test to see if we can go to my blog is also going to fail. But not because there's a problem with going to my blog, but because there was a problem with login. So now our debugging when we come into a problem gets to be a little bit complicated. It's not very clear why this test failed. So always when we're writing tests, automated tests, the aim is to make it as much as possible, make it so that we know exactly what's wrong when a test fails. We know exactly where in the code to look when a test fails, because we know that this test only tests this one thing. It only tests this one piece of our code. As much as possible, we strive for that. So if we write tests that are tightly coupled, that depend on some flow having taken place before we run this test, that's a bad practice. Okay? So one way that you can check yourself to make sure that you're writing tests that are independent and not coupled is to run them in isolation. So once you've written all your tests in your spec, put a dot only in front of each test, okay, to make sure that if it's the only test that runs, it works, okay? Because sometimes we'll write a bunch of tests, we'll run the spec runs, no problem. If we skip one of them, it breaks suddenly, right? So failing to run one test should not break any other test, in other words, okay? So that's what we're going to keep in mind as we're writing these tests. This is where using, this means that we're going to have to do some cleanup, right? So if we write a test to log in, for example, the cleanup for that test would be that we should be logging out. Okay, so another best practice though is that, and you'll read about this in the Cypress documentation, they mention it there, is that with integration testing, it's better to have the cleanup happen in a before hook, in a before each hook, rather than an after hook. Can you think about, why do you think that might be a better idea? Do you have any ideas about that? Why would we want to clean up before each test instead of after each test?
Because
before you're running that test, rather than when something happens that is failed, it doesn't run the after.
Yes?
Yeah.
That's one good reason. Yeah, one good reason is if we always clean up in before, then we know that we're starting from a nice clean place. The second reason is that if a test fails, we don't necessarily want to clean up. You know? If a test fails, when you run these Cypress tests, it leaves things as they are where it fails. Okay? Unless you clean it up specifically in your test. If you don't clean it up in your test, it just stops there. And that gives you an opportunity to look around and see what's gone on. What are the state of things? And that helps you to debug what the problem is. But if you're automatically cleaning up after every test, so say for example your test fails, you'll still go to an after hook. Okay? If you put your cleanup in an after hook, your test fails, it'll still execute the after hook. Now that after hook may or may not succeed depending on why the test failed, right? And depending on how you've written the hook. But if it happens to succeed, then you just cleaned up the problem, right? And it makes it harder to figure out what's gone wrong. So those are the reasons why it's better to clean up in before than to clean up in after. Okay, so that's the other thing we're going to keep in mind as we're writing our tests. Yeah, so you could use after to record some information. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about Cypress selectors. So Cypress tests use DOM selectors to select elements. That makes sense, right? So Cypress takes over our browser, it uses what's in the DOM, and it acts on the DOM. We tell it how we want it to act on the DOM. We basically use JavaScript to have it manipulate the elements in the DOM to behave like a user is behaving, and then we check to see what the outcome is, again by checking with DOM selectors to see what's there on the page, right? So we can use any selectors that are in the DOM. So we're going to have tons of selectors already there, right? But it isn't always and generally isn't a good idea to depend on the selectors that are already there. Sometimes it's okay, but it's a really bad practice to use CSS selectors because those things could change. In fact, the last product that I worked on, a lot of the CSS selectors were automatically generated with unique IDs. And so every time we updated the code, there was the potential that the CSS selectors might change. And you can't use those for testing them, right? So we don't, again, with the best practice in mind, that we don't want our test to be brittle. We don't want something changing that is inconsequential to the function of our app to break our tests, okay? So a best practice is to add attributes for testing to our app, okay? It doesn't hurt anything to do that. It makes it really clear what we're selecting on in our test, and we have more control over those selectors. So if we change the selectors, we make it really clear that these selectors are for testing, so that if they get changed, the person changing them knows this is going to impact the test. If I'm going to change the selector, I need to look at the tests that are using the selector. Okay, so we'll do some of that today, and there's a link to the Cypress documentation that talks some more about this if you want to have a look. But we're going to do that today. All right. So before we can get into it, though, we need to talk about, in addition to that, it uses selectors, so the commands that we use. So how do we access these selectors and how do we act on them? That's what we have to understand next. So we can look at a list of all the Cypress commands with full descriptions and examples on the API documentation page. Really nice documentation, okay? This lists all of the commands that you can run, and if you click on each of these, it gives you examples, it gives you a description of what it does and how it behaves. Really nice documentation. We're only going to look at sort of a handful of these today, okay, because I don't want to take your whole day. So I'm going to give you some really powerful ones, some really common ones. You could just use these and write a decent set of integration tests for any app, okay? But feel free to be curious and go check it out and see what else you could do, all right? All right, so let's look at some selection commands first, because the first thing we have to do is select elements of our DOM. Before we can do anything else, before we can act on them or check them to see what's set, we have to know how to select them. So get is a really common selector. We'll use this one a lot. And get will get potentially multiple selectors. So if we use get, for example, and we get an element like H1, we use a selector that's an HTML element, then it's going to get all the H1s on that page. Okay? So we always point Cypress to a page, and we'll look at that in a minute. Get will get all of the things that match that selector on that page. Okay? So we can select an HTML element, we could select a class selector, we can select an ID selector, and you can see the way that we refer to those is just the same way we do in CSS, so a dot for classes and a hash for IDs. And we can select something where we're saying an attribute equals a value. And the syntax for that is what you see there. We put it in brackets, and we're going to refer to an attribute, and we say attribute equals, and then we can't, if we use that star, the asterisk equals, then that's like a fuzzy search, okay? So it'll look for anything that contains that string. If you just put equals, it looks for something that equals that exactly. It's an exact match, okay? So if you want to use the fuzzy search, I've found that you have to put, no, actually that's not what it is. If there are spaces in the thing that you're searching for, then you need to put it in double quotes. We don't actually need the double quotes in this example here because there are no spaces. So if there are no spaces, it doesn't have to be in quotes, okay? But if there are any spaces, then you have to put it in quotes. And if you put it in double quotes, you have to put single quotes on the outside of the square brackets. Otherwise, you could use double quotes for those arguments, okay? So you could use double quotes around the H1, double quotes around, or single quotes. But if you're going to nest double quotes, if, for example, you're using an attribute selector and it has a space in it, then you have to put single quotes on the outside. So this is all sort of basic quoting requirements, but just let me know if any of that's not clear. You'll figure it out if you play with it.
Not that we're used to at the moment.
You might not be, but you will be as you work as a developer more because it will get you. Okay, so the next kind of selector we'll talk about is first, and as you might imagine, we can use first to get the first one. So we can chain first onto a get selector, and that will get the first instance of something. If there are multiple things that match that selector, that first will get the first one. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Contains is another one. Contains gets the first. So that's just how it is. It's just something you have to know. Contains gets the first element found containing the content that you specify. Okay, so we're not using a selector here, like a class or an element or an ID or an attribute. We're actually looking at the content. So the inner HTML, the text content, what's in between the angle bracket, in between the open and close element brackets of the element is what we're looking at there. Okay, that's what we're searching for with contains. So you can imagine that contains generally isn't a good idea. Why using contains might not be a good idea?
Because you might have, it's not specific enough in that you might have edit on lots of places.
That's one reason it could be. Yeah, what's another reason? How would this make your test brittle? Because we might change the text. For example, if we're translating our app into different languages, right? Then what's hello in English is going to be something else when it's in another language, okay? What's register in English is going to be something else in a different language. So if we're using contains, then we risk making our test brittle. The time that I use contains is if I'm looking for something in a URL. So we can get the URL that's displayed with URL. URL is the command, and that will return us the URL that's currently in the browser. And we could look for it contains in the URL. That's not likely to change, right? It's possible it will, but it's less likely to change what's in the URL string. Yeah.
Can you use regex?
You probably can.
It seems to make more sense for something like that where you can look for anything that has an email in it.
You could, yeah. I'm sure you can. I haven't checked for sure, Isaac, but my guess is that you'd be able to use regex. Yeah.
That just seems like an application where that wouldn't be brittle because it's something more we want to.
It's still, I would argue, still it could be brittle though. It could be brittle. So if you're looking for an ampersand or an @ symbol or something, then maybe, or possibly an email, yes, a specific email, but.
Yeah, like say for example, you want to just say if there is an email in there, and if it does actually.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to say that as a best practice, whenever possible, use a selector that you feel sure is not going to change. And in most cases, that's using an attribute selector that you've added for the purpose of testing. So sometimes that doesn't make sense, and sometimes it's not the most efficient way to do things, and sometimes it's not necessary, but a lot of times that's the best way to do things. Okay, another is find. Now find, you can't call directly to find something. Find has to be called as a chained element. So it has to be called on something that's returned, just like first. Okay? Just like first. We don't call first on its own. We call it as a chain to act on something returned by a previous command. Okay? So find is the same. And so if you see an error that says it looks like you've called a command that should be chained or something like that, that's related to using something like find. You can't say cy.find. Okay? You can chain a find on a get. So here, for example, we're selecting navbar, something with the class navbar, and then we're trying to do a find of the string logout somewhere in that element navbar. Okay? Say again? Yes, Git can return multiples.
Does one work with something that's multiples?
Um,
Is it the first one?
so I think I'm not sure of the answer to that. I think though that find may look in all the things that are returned. In fact, it does.
Okay.
So find will actually look in everything that's returned by Git for what you tell it to look for. Mm. And you can tell find to look for text or to look for a selector. Okay? So either look for content or a selector. Okay, within is another type of selector that can be useful. So it scopes, and this is another one that gets chained. All right? So you can use it, for example, to limit the scope of where you're looking, where you're trying to select. So if you're just trying to select on something inside of a form or something inside of a particular div or something else, then you can use within, and that just limits the scope of where Cypress looks for the thing that you're trying to get a hold of. So we can also select the entire document if we want to. You can do that with document. We can also select the root of the DOM with .root. We can also select the URL with .url, and that will return the URL that's currently being displayed in the browser. Okay. So, in addition to those selection commands, we can take actions. So these are actions that mimic user actions. So we can click, we can right click, we can type into a field, we can clear a field, we can focus or unfocus, we can check or uncheck, we can select or unselect, we can hover, we can scroll into view, submit. All the actions that a user can do, we can do with Cypress, okay, to mimic that user action. And then there are some other useful Cypress commands. Go, if we want it to go to a specific URL, and it's going to be relative to the base URL. Okay? So whatever we put there will be tacked on to, no, it'll be relative to the base URL. So it'll be tacked on the end. As long as you've set a base URL, then it will be relative to the base URL. Okay? So we can tell it to go to /post or to go to /login or whatever. Okay? Viewport is very useful to explicitly set the size of the viewport. Why do you think this is important? Yeah, because in our blog client app, if the width is below a certain amount, our nav bar is hidden or not. Like, there are different things available in the DOM, you know, whether or not, depending on the size of the screen. And a lot of times that's true. What's actually attached to the DOM will be dependent on the viewport size if we've got a responsive design, right? And so our test will fail, you know, unpredictably, because the viewport size is different when we run the test. And we can't have that. So we explicitly set the viewport size in our before each hook or our before hook, and that way we know that what we know what we should expect in the DOM when the viewport is that size. Okay? And you can imagine that we would have a different, you know, we would run the test differently. There would be some tests that are slightly different for different viewport sizes, right, to test that things display the way we expect them to in each of the sizes. So that one's important. There's also clear cookies, and clear local storage, which could be useful to us as well. Okay? All right, so the last thing that we'll talk about before we look at writing some tests is assertions. How do we do assertions? So like I mentioned, Cypress uses try. So we're already familiar with these kinds of assertions, at least somewhat. So we can look at the documentation for assertions, which basically just points to the CHI documentation. So we could use should or expect in our assertions, just like we would for any other unit test that we're doing. There's so many other things we can do with Cypress. Okay, I'm only going to give you the tip of the iceberg here, give you enough to be useful for some powerful integration testing, but there's a lot more that you can do than what I'm going to cover today. So have a look. Take some time when you have time to explore it and see what else you can do. Some of you might really enjoy it, you know, and find that you really have a love for testing and want to be a test engineer, because it is quite a bit of fun actually when you get into it. And it's writing code, okay? It's not any less writing code than, you know, the code that we're writing. It's still writing code. It's just writing it for a different purpose. Okay. All right, so let's write some tests now. So we have Cypress integration. Let's create a folder in there called users, and we're going to create a test for the login, logout user flow, and we'll put it in that folder just to keep our stuff nicely organized. So in Cypress integration, we're going to create a folder called users. And inside of that folder, inside of that folder we're going to create a test file called login logout spec.js inside the users folder. Okay, so we're going to write our test in the spec file. So when we write Cypress tests, we have to think about what a user does. To write a test for login, we have to think about how does a user log into our app. So if we look at our app, which I've got running here, to log in, we're at the home page, right? And we click on login. That takes us to the sign-in page. And then we type in a username, and we type in a password, and we click login. And when we do that, we expect it to take us back to the home page, right? And it should say, we should see that we're logged in. So we're going to write a test that mimics that action. So we've configured base URL, so we know that it's going to get to the right home page. And let's start by just writing this test. So to go to the login page, we're just going to test first that we can go to the login page if we click login. Okay? So one way we can do that is we can tell it to visit home, and if it contains login, or actually we're going to look for the element that contains login, the text login, so this isn't the best way to do things, is it? And then we're going to click it. And when we click that, we expect that the URL should include auth login. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so we're going to, I'm going to copy and paste it otherwise. You can do the same. I have Vim enabled in my other computer, so I keep trying to use Vim in here. So you'll see me type lots of K's and J's and L's. All right, does this make sense to everybody? What we're doing here? No, so this is ES6 syntax. We don't need semicolons. Yeah, don't worry about it complaining about CY. It does until we run it the first time. I'm not sure why exactly. Because we're not referring to it anywhere here, right? But obviously there's something that's set up in the Cypress environment that defines that variable, but it doesn't become aware of it. VS Code doesn't become aware of it until we run the test. Okay, so we have that test, and we'll try running it. So we're going to open the test runner unless you have it open already. So mine's open right now. So remember to open the test runner. If you don't have it open, it's yarn run Cypress open if you're using yarn. And if you're no, you don't have to. So it doesn't matter what you do in your app because it's going to launch its own version. Okay, the test runner is going to launch its own version.
Cypress.
Let Barsha help you. Okay. So if we click on this. No. No, you shouldn't have to. No.
So just close it.
So I've got a problem.
I've got to getting started, drag your project here. what
Can
the
you drag and drop in
Code migration
Yeah.
test.
Square bracket.
Say again?
Oh.
On the visit.
Oh yeah, that doesn't belong there.
So this would be good. Can you see it?
So you'll see that when you make changes to your file, okay, when you make changes to your file, it will automatically rerun. If you've got the test runner running, and if you're running a spec, when you make changes to that spec file or any of the files in your project, it'll rerun that spec. Now I've got another problem. So it's running the test now, but somebody tell me what the problem is here. I just clicked on it in the test runner.
Where is it? Oh, run.
Not runs, tests. It's in tests,
Yeah.
and I just minimized examples. It's under users, and it's there.
I
So
don't have any users.
it's the users folder. You should have a users folder under the integration folder.
You're in my
No.
No? Okay, so make sure that in VS Code you have a users folder underneath the integration folder. Okay?
Wait,
So
you have it, but how come mine's
users
not
folder,
there?
and make sure you've saved it. Users folder underneath integration folder with the file in it.
Yeah, but mine's not. How do I get it to open that?
And then in Cypress, you should see it show up. If you don't close, I mean, I didn't reopen Cypress. It should just show up there.
Is the users
You still don't see
folder
it there.
being visible for
So make
everybody?
sure
Close
it's
it.
in, you're running Cypress from the right place. I'm assuming if it shows integration test at all.
Jenna,
Yes?
we're supposed to drag and drop the block client into
The what?
into Cypress. The
No.
No, you don't have to.
No, if you run it from blog client, it should be okay.
So if you run it from blog client, so you go yarn.
It's here. Come to the lesson. Come back to the lesson. You have to come back.
Yeah, with yarn.
Looks like actually.
Yarn run to Cypress.
Yarn.
This is let me see a line and not open it. Yeah, now go back. Now go back to your
Yeah, well, it's got to open it.
It's inside of there. Yeah, I think somehow, even though it's not showing
Close
there.
that.
Yeah,
They
close
chose
that.
that.
Folder.
Oh,
It's
okay.
outside.
Open it, right?
Right.
Okay.
Now,
Close the example.
close example. Users is not there now. Hang on. Not ready to play.
Seven is running.
Oh, okay. All right, so we've got to go. Yarn.
No, not here.
Start.
Not here.
Okay. So if you click on that spec,
Can
just
you
click on
open
that spec file.
New terminal window. So if you open a new one, go to shell, new window. Correct.
Now, this you may or may not see this error. So who sees this error?
Now go to block one.
Did it work for you? Did it work for anybody? Did anybody pass for anybody? Are you having different problems? Yeah?
full on. Is it syntax error?
Yeah, so I think I have a square bracket in what I...
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, so take the square bracket out. It's just a typo in the README. So there's a square bracket after visit, I think. Take that out.
Right.
And now go and refresh.
And now if you don't even have to rerun it. It should rerun on its own. So if you look, it should run.
And refresh. Oh, there's no option.
So, did yours fail like mine?
It's the same.
Same error? Okay, so somebody tell me why we're getting this error. So let's look at it. It says Cypress error, timed out retrying. So one thing to know is that Cypress will try for a bit. It'll wait and it'll try to look for a DOM element to give it, because we're testing something dynamic, it considers maybe I just need to wait for the DOM to get updated, and it'll retry. But there's a timeout that's set. So it's saying timed out retrying CY click failed because this element is not visible. And then it says navbar item data CY equals login. Oops, it shouldn't say data CY.
Yeah, because no one knows that.
Hold on. Change, oh no, I'm using contains. Let me make sure I'm running my Cypress test from the right place. Hang on 1 second, because yours might say, what does yours say, Tony? It might say something slightly different from mine.
What? But the users folder,
Yeah,
is
you're
not
not
coming up.
You might not click there.
No, the users is not coming up, Janelle, for me for some reason. And it's in the right place.
No, it's okay.
Okay,
Then you go on stop.
Stop.
Command tab. Command tab. Command tab.
So you have to be running the client in order for it to work.
Stop.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm not seeing the folder. And I'm in log client.
Okay, so,
Can you just come here because
mm,
Tasha can't work it out. Because I'm not running.
yeah, that's because you just put it in the wrong place. That's all, you put it in the wrong place. You created it in the wrong place, that's why it's there.
Where is it?
No, you put it in the examples folder.
Integration slash examples.
Yes,
Where is it supposed to be?
in integration.
Just in integration. Where's the integration?
It's one level up. So you can just drag it up one level to integration. Okay,
Where's integration? I can't even see integration.
It's like she has integration slash
Slash
examples
examples.
and that
Yeah,
resource is
I
sitting
know.
inside that.
look, all you have to do is do this. There you go. Done.
Okay. And then.
Okay, so what's the problem, Tony?
Yeah, we start with Cypress again. Yeah.
It's the same as yours.
Yeah, so what's the problem? Why is it failing?
Because the viewport is too small, so
Yeah.
the login just doesn't exist.
Login's not there. When we can see it on the screen, there's no login. So it tries to find login. Login's not visible on the DOM right now, so it doesn't work. So what's the best way to fix this?
False, true. On the
We could, what's a better way to fix it?
And then.
change the viewport.
Yeah, set the viewport size explicitly so I know what I'm testing.
Test,
Run.
test, test.
You can force true.
That's okay.
You can. And sometimes that's appropriate. Okay? But in this case, it should have us think, okay, I'm depending on my viewport here. I'm expecting, that this is always visible, and that's not true. So I should explicitly set my viewport size so that I know what to expect. So my testing's more deterministic. Okay? All right. So
Mine's not working, Janelle, still. See,
No, but that error is fine.
That's only CY error.
Yeah, that's fine.
is there, if you copy directly from the README, there's a typo in it. Right there.
Where?
Delete that square bracket and save.
Delete the square bracket. Yeah, to save that.
All right, so if we set the viewport size like this in our test, okay, and we save that change, you shouldn't have to rerun the test. If you just go back, I set the viewport size, then it passes. Okay, does it make sure it passes for you? If you set the viewport size, it's in the README. Does it pass for you now? Okay. Now I'm going to show you, if we look at the inspector, we can click on these in the console. We can click on each one of these. So when we do contains login, it shows you what gets yielded by that. That can be really useful as you're writing your tests, okay? To see what calling the selector command actually is giving you back. Will show you that, okay, if you look in the console. So what are we testing so far?
She did all of
that we can get to the login page, and that's it. That's all we're testing so far, is that we can get to the login page. And if you see, you can also, when you click on each one of these, you can see what the state was at each of those points. That's pretty cool too, when you're trying to debug what's gone wrong. So when I click on that, that's what we had. When I click on this, this is what we had. When I click the button, or when I click the login link, you can see it's got the little red pointer. Do you see that? On login, it's showing you that it clicked there. And when I click it, you can see
Why is it not showing me the
when I
web
get
page?
to, yeah, when I get past the new URL,
See, your desktop's still running.
I can see that I got to this page. So that's useful too. Okay? I like that it does that
Why
for
have
you.
you got your page there?
Because you said
What?
run all
Have you got
specs,
the
right?
page
It's
there?
What do you mean?
Mine's not got the page
It's still
there.
under testing, so you cannot
Okay.
show the screenshot while the
Mine's got
tests
the
are
local
running.
page there.
Okay. Did you just run the login logout test?
We did run all the specs.
No, don't run all specs. Just click on login logout spec. Just stop it in the test runner, stop it, and just click the login logout spec.
That's errors, that's errors.
Come on.
Yes, that's
See, right? Stop it.
I need to fix that
Yeah,
in
just
here.
click that, yeah.
Why doesn't that open in my Chrome that's already open now?
Because it opens a new browser.
Yeah.
Because it takes over the browser.
So it could not load 3000.
Make sure that you have Chrome selected as the browser that's using in the test runner.
Go to C1 again. Running in Chrome.
Yep.
Chrome selected.
Yep.
It should run
So
in
Vic,
Chrome 79.
Vic, just pay attention to me for now, otherwise we won't get through on time, okay? Because we've got people coming at 11:45 that other people might want to go talk to. So just watch me for now, okay? All right, so we've verified the login URL, but that's all we verified. We haven't actually verified that the sign-in component displays. So what are some things we could check to verify that the sign-in component displays? Yeah, so this is a really lazy test here. Okay, we're going to refactor this, but this is, a lazy way to do it. We can get the root and see that it contains the word username. Why is this a bad idea? Yeah,
Because username could be an email and not.
no, we're looking for the label, but the label text could change. If, for example, we translated this page into another language, okay? So this is not the right way to do it, but it's sort of like a quick way, right? And you'll see tests like this, but it's not very good.
Out of curiosity, can Cypress access other variables? So, for example, if you were to use the word username, can you declare that as a constant?
You can.
So if you were to change the word, it would then
Yeah.
change the word.
Absolutely. We're just writing JavaScript, right? So you can declare variables however you want. You can declare them in another file and pull it in. You can declare them in the test file itself.
Well, I know this is sort of hacky word frame, but I just think that would reduce how
You could. You could, but it's much easier, I'd argue, to just create test attributes. Yeah. Yeah. So this will work. Let's just convince ourselves it'll work. So just copy this second if block, and if we put that in, and then again, we don't have to rerun our test. It'll automatically rerun every time we update the file, as long as it's running. And you can see that this works. Okay? So it shows us
Where did you put
that we
text
found,
in your-
we found
over
username
the
and
other
password.
text or
Just
under the
underneath
other?
in the same describe. So we're ignoring a best practice. I skipped ahead. Spoiler alert. Okay. But here's another problem, another best practice we've broken. What does this second test depend on? Besides the fact that we've got the actual text username and password on the screen. What other best practice are we breaking? What happens if I do this? What do you think is going to happen if I do that? Is this going to work?
What did you do?
I make that the only test that runs. Is that going to work? Why isn't that going to work? I haven't navigated there yet, right? So if we save this and run, it's trying to look for that username and password, and then it times out. Okay? So we can't do it this way. This isn't okay. So let's introduce a before each hook. So before each, we're going to reset the state of things and to a place that we know we're always starting from for every test. Okay? And in that before each, we'll set the viewport and we'll make sure we're on the home page. Okay? And actually, we don't even need to click the home page, because if we just visit / we'll be there. So you can leave off that second bit. So if we put this before I describe, we don't need this last line. It's not necessary. I'm going to move this comment here. What happened? And then I'm going to put a comment here. And then we can get rid of setting the viewport here, and we can also get rid of visit home here, right? Just watch me, Vic. Just watch me. Okay, so let's make sure this works if we take off the only. So we still haven't fixed that problem, but just make sure we haven't broken anything by moving that setup into before each. So, oh wait, that's failing, but why is that failing? If I don't skip the second test, why is it failing now? Why does the second test fail now? Yeah, because before each runs before every test, before every it block. So now, after I run the first test, I'm going back to the home page. Okay? So we still have to do something else. So what do you think we need to do? What we're going to have to do is, in our test to see that we render the component, we need to do all the steps from the starting point to get us to that place, right? So we need to click on the login link, and then we can check that. Okay? So we're just going to add this line here.
But then wouldn't that essentially render the first test obsolete?
So the reason it doesn't is because imagine that you've got hundreds of tests, right? And imagine that the second test fails, but the first test succeeds. What does that tell you? The problems in registration. But if the second test fails and the first test fails,
I was just wondering, is there a way to sort of chain them or establish the tests in a hierarchy that you only test?
the problem, yeah, we could just what we were doing before, okay? But that still doesn't solve our problem, because the problem is that we want to know when a test fails, why did it fail, okay? And if we depend on chaining them, then that doesn't really help us. Do you know what I mean? If both tests fail, we know the problems with the first test, right? We know the problems with the first test. And the other thing that we have to consider is there might be reasons that some of these tests don't run that are unrelated to anything in particular with the app. Like maybe there was a network problem when the first test ran or something, okay, that wasn't there when the second test ran. That can happen. I've actually seen it happen, running a big group of Cypress tests before. Randomly some tests will fail in there. You rerun it again and they don't fail because there was some kind of network glitch or something. So it's about two things. It's about not having one test depend on another test. It's about having, so that we can run the test in isolation every time and they work. And it's about being able to isolate the problem when a test fails.
I was I was just thinking the way we're trying to click on the second one, would it be better to just explicitly navigate to
We
the
could.
URL?
Yeah, absolutely. So we could do this.
So just look at it, I'm thinking, we're just testing through things, again, there's not.
So we can do that.
It's still not,
Oh, not URL, sorry,
still
go.
not picking up the local.
Or visit. Visit and go, I'm pretty sure do the same thing. Okay. So let's just make sure so that's okay too. And that probably is better than test and click. Yeah. All right, so let's stop using contains and introduce some test attributes.
So Janelle,
Mm.
is it in the API.js where you're supposed to have localhost 3000? Where did we originally put the localhost?
We put that in Cypress JSON.
Cypress JSON.
Mm. So let's look at the places we're depending on contains right now, and let's add attributes. So right now, where is that login at? Which file is that in? I think I've already added it mistakenly here, but let's see. So login is in nav, right? So where we have login, instead of using login in the attributes, I'm going to add one called data-cy, and I'm going to always call it data-cy, okay, equals login. No. Interesting, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking.
So the only reason it causes a problem, it only causes a problem with class. Well, no, it causes a problem if you embed it in if it's in a value. That's where it causes problems.
Oh no, I was thinking more the fact that we, like, you know, a lot of those attributes don't have actual way, like, class.
There is no link. Can you
Yes.
Yeah, I just,
maximize it?
someone might have to.
Yeah. So where else are we using contains?
Where's the login one?
So instead of looking for username and password, it's in the second method. So instead of looking for username and password, we could just look for the form, couldn't we? We could just look for the form that we expect to be there. So we can put an attribute on the form. Which file is that in?
I think you skipped it. You have to go back.
That's in sign in. So we have a form here, and we can add data cy is login form. And then we can modify our test. So instead of doing contains login, we'll do get, and we'll specify an attribute, and we do that in square brackets. So we say data cy equals login.
So where are you, instead of contains, you're putting here.
Let's make sure I didn't break it. Data cy equals login. It's in the README too. So that still works. So far I've just changed using that attribute. Then we can do, instead of checking for this, we can do cy.get data cy equals login form, and we can check that it's visible. So that tests that the login form is visible.
Now, can you just copy that and put it into like copy?
It's actually in the README.
Whereabouts?
We're changing sign in buttons.
Yes.
Oh, this one. Oh, I
You need to change the setting in sign in button.
So does this make sense? Why I made this change?
Okay? Add that line. Sign in button. It's into the comments. Sign in. Okay. I'm waiting for you.
Okay, so this is in the README too. If you want to copy it from there, you can just copy it directly from there. So here's the other thing. Oh, we removed this actually, so you don't have to worry about that one. Okay. All right, so now we can add a test to make sure we can log in. Okay, so now we can see that we render the page. That's all good, but now we need to see if we can actually log in. And this is the point where we're actually testing from the front to the back, right? So far we've just been really testing the client side. So now we're going to add a test that actually tests our server side too. So if we're going to log in, then we have to have a username and a password, right? And it has to be a known user in our environment. So the proper way to handle this really is to, either if we're testing in our development environment, we might just have a user that we use for testing, okay? If it's a test environment, we would have that kind of setup. We would have, certain text fixtures that are in place in that environment that we could depend on for our testing. There would be a script that would set that up so that we know that it's there. What we could do in our test is we could actually register a user from our test to use for testing and then delete that user when we're done testing. So we're not going to get into all of that detail right now because I think it will just go on too long. But if you look at the code complete for this lesson, I implemented a registered user testing that workflow. And to do that, I had to implement something else in our server. And I had to implement something else on the client to really enable doing it all from Cypress. Because in order to delete a user, we actually have that ability built into our server already. You have to be an admin user.
The problem with that though is what happens if everything just crashes halfway through testing and you and then you're testing in a file because it exists.
So in your before each, you need to make sure you always start from a clean environment. So in your so say again.
So like if we're actually registering,
Mm-hmm.
so if you're testing that and it's actually registered to use it with the database, and you don't actually finish your test, you just crash halfway through and never get to the point where you delete it.
In your before each, you just delete it, and then.
That's right. So if you look at what I have in code complete for register user, it uses, I make a change to the server? I think I did have to make a change to the server to enable it. And I had to make a change to the client so that I actually have a page, an admin page, that displays the users with a delete button. Because I tried, Cypress does have some methods that let you make direct calls to the server, but it's really difficult to do it because it doesn't maintain the session. It creates a new session every time you make a call. So I make a call to log in as the admin user, but if I make another call to delete a user after that, it doesn't send over. It's created another session with a different session ID, and so I get an authentication error. So you would have to add some support on your server to sort of log in and delete, or something else. You'd have to, add something else to your authentication implementation to support that. So I found it easier. It didn't take me very long to implement in the client a page that you have to be the admin user to get to that lists all the users with a delete button next to each one. And then I just use Cypress to go to that page, delete the user that I've created for the test. And I do that in my before each hook.
Yeah, so that's not like an admin.
No, it's something you need anyway.
Just generate a great username though. What happens if somebody's actually
Go to your JSA.
Yeah, so the way that you get around that is you pick a name that's like so unlikely that anybody would pick. I wasn't that careful. I just did like underscore test admin and underscore test user, right? But you would be more diligent about that if you were concerned about conflicts. And then you have to handle things different again in a production environment, because you don't necessarily want to insert data into a production environment. Sometimes it's unavoidable, and you just have to be really thoughtful in the way that you do it. So a lot of this is more appropriate for running your test in a test environment or staging environment or something like that. You might remove those tests that are potentially destructive from your production test suite.
So just thinking like the registering, or you just see a lot of potential conflict in
There is. There is. And you definitely have to be thoughtful about what you need to clean up and how you're cleaning it up when you write integration tests like this. You have to, it's one of the biggest concerns and one of the biggest challenges is to have that done. Like I said, yesterday I wrote an extension to the client to add a page to delete users so that I could implement that.
What I was thinking was to actually have a bit on that you know something about it to say that this was red for testing in the web server to just clean them up.
You could, right? And so that requires a modification on your server. And you could. And sometimes when you are, engineering your tests, and that's why there are people who just focus on test engineering, and feeding information back to the development team about, okay, we need this in place in order to be able to run really good tests. There's a whole world there, of things to think about and ways to do it that are non-destructive and that are, really effective for testing. And then you have to think about performance too. There's a whole world of things to think about that we're not going to delve into because we just don't have time, But yeah, it's a career path, absolutely. And some people really enjoy it, And so it's a development path, just like any other development path. Yeah. Okay, so to enter information. Yeah, just pay attention to me because I'm going to move ahead. We need to talk about fixtures. So fixtures are really powerful. We're not going to look at them completely in this lesson. I'm just going to show you one way to use fixtures. So fixtures are a way for us to define the test data that we want to enter in our test. That's how we're going to use it, okay? And so what we're going to do is we're going to create, you'll notice in the Cypress directory there's a directory called fixtures, and there's an example in there, okay? So it's just JSON, stringified JSON. I guess JSON is stringified. It's just JSON. So we're going to create a fixture, and we'll call it, what did I call it? I can't remember what I called it. Registered user. So the idea is that this fixture is going to be a user that's already registered that we're going to log in as, okay? And so we're going to have a username, and we're going to pick a username that we know is already registered with our app, okay? Or we're going to create a user in our app and register as a user in our app and use that username here. So for now, for speed purposes, I'm just going to use Gigi because I know that that's a user in my app and the password. Okay. So it's just a way to store the information that we're going to use in our test. Instead of hard coding it in the test itself, it gives us an easy way to change it, right? So now what we're going to do is we have to populate a variable in our before hook that we can use in our test, okay? A variable with this fixture data in it. And the way we do that is with the fixture command in Cypress. So we call fixture, we pass it the name of the JSON file. It's going to look for it in that fixture directory, okay? And we'll put a then on it, so it returns not quite a promise. It's like a promise, but it's not a promise. So we're going to call then on that, and then we're going to store that user in a local variable. And the way we do that is we refer to the local variable as this dot variable name. Now, In order to refer to this in this file, we cannot use ES6 syntax for the function that we've defined it in. We have to use, it's really weird and really annoying. So if you are running a test using a fixture and it says that this isn't found, or something like that, have a look and see if you're using ES6 syntax in that test. Only in the test the block of code, the before hook or the it that's referring to this, do you have to change the syntax, okay? So I'm just going to copy this fixture bit, and in our login logout spec, I'm going to change this syntax. I'm going to paste this in. Okay, so that's going to pull the user from that fixture, and now I have access to it. All right, so now that I have that, then I can test that I can log in. So now we're going to add some more attributes so that I can grab the fields that we need. We've already got an attribute for the login button, so we can click on that. Or we can just go directly to the page instead. I like that. Then we'll add an attribute for the username and password in the sign-in form and for the button. Okay, so let's do that. So in the sign-in, in the form, in the input field, okay, not the label, but the input field, I'm going to add a data cy equals username. And in the password field, I'm going to add a data cy equals password. And in the submit field, I'm going to add a data cy equals login button. I was gonna aim to stop at 11:45.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, is that all right? Hey, Matt.
That is better.
Okay. So now in our login logout, we can add another test to our test login describe block, and I'm going to copy paste. Instead of this first one, I'm going to use the visit because I like that better too. So I'm just going to replace this first one with CY visit. Okay, so can you see what we're doing here? I'm just grabbing that username input field using the attribute we just set, right? And then I'm typing the username from the registered user that I populated from the fixture in the before each hook. Does that make sense? And I'm doing the same for password, and then I'm grabbing the button with the attribute that I set on the button, and I'm clicking it. Okay? And that works. And we can see, and then I test that it takes us to post. I could also test that the nav bar then contains my username. That would be another good test to put there. Does this make sense to everybody, what we did in this test?
The Cypress log your test
So let's talk about that. I'm going to skip a bit and let's talk about recording test runs. Okay, so the next part here talks about logging out. All right, so we added check in there's a little bit of something here about in the before hook. This gets to what if a test fails or we haven't run the test before. We can't assume that we're always logged in, right? When we run the first test, we're not logged in yet. So there is something about when we call get, if it can't find the thing, it errors. And so what we need to do is we need to, in a then clause on the get for the nav bar, we do a find
for the logout button.
for the logout. That's right.
That way we know where it's found.
And we only click logout if logout's visible. Okay, so that's what we have. That's what this little bit is about here. Is in order to write a robust before hook. Okay, we have to do this. But I'm going to skip ahead to talk about recording test runs. So just watch me for now instead of following along, because you have to log into a Cypress dashboard, and I think I had to create an account to do this. It's a free account. Yeah, so you can log in with your GitHub actually, and that's what I did. I logged in with GitHub. So you have to go to the dashboard. You can log in with your GitHub. That's what I did. And then you have to, I created an organization, but I don't think you have to. You can just use your personal organization. And then I created a project. Okay? So I created a project called Blog Client. And the way that I did that is explained here. So actually the instructions are here to generate a project ID. Then you do that in the test runner. You generate a project ID in the test runner. And that automatically, when you generate that project ID, it gets added to your cypress.json file. Okay? And then you also, when you generate a project ID, you get a record key that's associated with this project. So what this does is it creates a connection between the test running in this project to what gets stored. So it stores all the tests that are run for this project against that project key. So you can have multiple projects where you're running tests. They each have their own project and project record ID, record key, and the test gets stored with that project. So that's how Cypress does that, how it manages that. Okay?
So you have one for client and one for server.
No, because this is integration testing, it's end to end.
Right.
So I'm going to show you what I've got. I can show you what I have in Code Complete because I've already done that, just in the interest of time. So the key that it gives you, you have to specify when you want it to record tests. When you want it to record, you have to give it the key and then tell it to record. And it'll record against that key. So you can see the way that I managed that was in the package JSON. I added another script that I called Run Cypress. You can call it whatever you want. And I put my key in there. Okay? And then I run Cypress, which is in node modules.bin Cypress, with the record flag. And then I'm telling it to use Chrome as the browser. Okay? And this allows me to run Cypress from the command line with recording. Okay? So, if I do that,
So send it to me package, Jason. When you run your start script, and it will automatically do it. So you can just go yarn start and then run. Cool. Is that right?
I have to say yarn run Cypress because that's what I call the script. So I'm going to show you in my package JSON. I've got my keys stored in, what did I do with it? I had a local ENV on my other machine. Not there. There it is. So that's the key that was automatically generated for me when I did when I created a project ID. So now what I can do is I can say yarn run Cypress, and you see it just runs the command associated with that script. It opens the browser so I can actually see it, and it records it. It creates a video for each spec. Syntax error. It's alright. So I have 3 different. Yeah, so you know, if you're testing and you're not the developer, you want somebody else to work on it, you can put it in the PR or whatever. You know, you can link to it. Yeah. It is. And it also, I'll show you, it gives you like a summary of all the results too. So I have 3 spec files in Code Complete. I have one for login, logout, I have one for register user, and I have one for blog posts, for doing flows related to blog posts. So you can have a look at those. And one of them failed. I'm not sure why. We can have a look. But if you look in the test runner, so if I just run the test runner with yarn run Cypress open, which just opens the test runner, and you go to the runs tab, it'll say you have to log in. It'll open a browser. It'll prompt me to log in. And then it'll say you can go back to the test runner, you're logged in. Okay, it takes me back here, and I can see all the runs that I've done and whether or not there were failures. Okay, so I can look at this one. This will open it up in the dashboard, and I can have a look at, this is the one that failed. I can look at the output, I can look at the screenshots, or I can look at the video. And the video is stored in your Cypress folder under videos. And so you can see I added that to my git ignore because I don't want to push up to the repo because I've been running this a lot. Actually, it shows you the last video, I guess, is what it does. So you can look at the video. Just record. It's probably there are settings you can, you know, change the format it records in, and you can watch the video.
Is it on the cloud as well?
It's,
Maybe that's like premium.
yeah, it might be, although there is a link to look at the video here. Let's see if it lets me. It looks like it did push it up there. So that's, I guess, why you have organizations. So you can have people that belong to your organization and they have access to the dashboard so they can have a look. Pretty cool, right? Like very, very little effort, I think, to get all of that, you know? Because seriously, I didn't just walk through the steps because we're running out of time, but they're not hard. They're really not hard. You just follow the steps that are right here. You generate a project ID. It adds it to the Cypress JSON for you. You don't even have to do that step. You just have to copy the key, the record key that it gives you, and you have to set it either in your environment or, you know, I did it in the package JSON file is how I did it, so that it just sets it before it runs. Not hard. Not hard to do. And so you set that up and you just run that command, you know, the script command, every time you want to run your test. And then if one fails, you can always go back and just run that test. So there's also a spec argument. Let me show you. I can do, let me close this. So I can run it from the test runner, obviously, but I can also do this. I can also say -- spec and say blog post spec JS. I think that's the one that failed. And it'll just run that one. So if you just want to run single specs, if you just want to run one spec, you can do that too from the command line. Oh gosh, what did I call it? I wonder if I have to tell it it's in post.
It's free for 3 users and 500 test recording.
There you go.
And
I'm doing wrong here. Blog post.spec.js. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong here. Matching this pattern. Blog post spec.js. I can't find them. Okay, I'm not sure why that's not. It should be working. You can see it's looking for that file. That file is there, so I don't know why it's not finding it. I wonder if it's where I put it. No, it should be okay. Anyway, I won't get stuck on that. I'll work it out and I'll let you know. But I know I did that earlier, so there's something silly I'm doing, I'm sure. Okay, so have a play with it. There's also a link here about how to integrate Cypress with GitHub. So you can create a continuous integration workflow with Cypress directly with a GitHub repo so that Cypress tests run on certain hooks, either on a commit status check or a pull request comment. You can have it like hook into Cypress and run tests. So that's pretty cool too. And yeah, have fun with it. Have a play with it. If you have time in the near future, play with it so you don't forget too many things. But I've tried to write the lesson like I do the others, so it's really comprehensive, so you should be able to follow along. And try later if you wait a while and you try to integrate with your. And remember that those examples that it comes with are really good too. So use those examples. You can get ideas about how to do things just by looking at the plethora of examples that it gives you when you install it. Okay. Yeah? What did you do?